Hey, seniors, what's up? Okay, I'm using this software that I hate, and I feel like before I start saying anything about biology, I must talk about why it's frustrating. So this software allows me to make a 15-minute video, and this slideshow is going to be just slightly longer than 15 minutes, and so I'm going to cut it up into two sort of reasonable sections, and I might ramble a bit, so feel free to change the speed of the video playback, and I'm also going to be pausing the video periodically to sort of throw out questions. But when I say I'm pausing the video, I mean I'm going to throw questions your way, and I encourage you to pause the video and actually answer them, and then hit the video again so you can give yourself a chance to see if you really are keeping up with what you're sort of taking down. All right, I guess that's it. Let's do it. So we've been talking a lot about eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms, and how they communicate with different parts of their tissues. Now, before we move on, we have to acknowledge that there are also bacterial cells, which are single cellular. So what they do is they release signals outside of their body, right? Because they're not going to communicate with other cells because they only have one cell. So instead, they release these chemicals outside of their body, and most of these chemicals are called autoinducers. So imagine our little lonely friend here in the middle. It's all alone and it's releasing these autoinducers outside of its body. This little white one right in the middle. And this little white cell, I'm going to draw some stuff because why not? This little white cell right here is just releasing chemicals. Bop, de bop, de boop, de bop, de boop, de bop, de boop. Now imagine all of these white cells are also doing this. And you can see pretty quickly all of these chemicals are going to build up in concentration. And what happens is at a certain point, we get a crowded enough area. We would call that crowd a quorum. So once we reach the quorum, now suddenly we are at a point where, lasers, pew, pew, pew. We're at a point where this population is dense enough. We've reached the quorum, and therefore we have enough chemicals being released that they cause a response. This is called quorum sensing. We've hit the quorum. We've hit the required number of individuals to make enough chemicals to cause a response. And so quorum sensing will cause the bacteria to respond as a group, which is very, very cool. So one very cool thing bacteria can do is at quorum sensing, when it is reached, is they will glow. We call this bioluminescence. Not all species, of course, but some will do that. One other thing they do is if they get into a big enough group, they're going to start to swarm. They kick on their flagella and they swim like crazy. Their motility increases, and so they will move in sort of a uniform direction. It's very neat. And my favorite is this one, a biofilm. So this is technically a type of behavior, I suppose. What they do is some bacteria will actually stick to a solid surface. In waterways, aquatic bacteria, cyanobacteria, can make this huge, gross, sticky mat. And on your teeth, actually, there are bacteria stuck to your teeth because when they hit the quorum for quorum sensing, they release autoinducers. The autoinducer concentration gets high enough. And what they do is they release this glue-like substance that holds them all together and to a hard substance such as your teeth. And lastly, they can also decide to be relatively friendly or, again, in the right concentration, if they reach a quorum, they can become virulent and start releasing nasty chemicals, and that's how they make you sick. Cool. Let's keep going. Now, back to the more familiar stuff. Eukaryotic cells, multicellular organisms, such as ourselves, we rely on chemicals to communicate within the body. We call these chemical signaling molecules, and more specifically, they function as what is called a ligand. And a ligand is a molecule that is used to bind to another larger complex. In biology, this is the only context. So I'm going to use ligand simply to refer to a molecule which binds to some other molecule, usually a receptor. So let's think about some examples that we have already covered. And now we'll just apply the word ligand to these examples. Hormones bind to receptors. those receptors. And so the hormone would be the ligand. Neurotransmitters such as acetylcholine bind to receptors. Yeah, and so the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is a ligand which binds to a receptor. Drugs such as neonicotinoids, pesticides, it's a drug, binds to a neurotransmitter receptor. Cocaine, still a ligand, not binding to a receptor. The difference with cocaine is it still binds as a ligand, but it binds in this case to the transport protein to block reuptake of dopamine, right? And so still binding, still a ligand, but not technically to a receptor. Another weird example with antigens, those are the proteins on the outside of your cells, which will then bind to not antigens, but antibodies. So we have our ligand, the antigen, binding to the antibody, still have a thing binding to another thing, and so it still functions as a ligand. So this is all the stuff that we have already covered. And here comes the new material. Not so new. Actually, we've already covered calcium, but I need to remind you here that calcium also functions as a ligand. Now, this is a moment to pause me. Here's my question. Get ready to pause the video. Question is this. Calcium binds to what? Calcium is the ligand. What does it bind to in the process of muscle contraction? Pause me. Answer the question. I pause. All right, hopefully you've answered the question. Calcium binds to troponin, which then moves tropomyosin for cross-bridge formation during muscle contraction. So calcium is our ligand in this example. It's not a hormone, but it is a ligand that causes a change in the cells. All right, new stuff. Okay, here's what we have already covered. We have already discussed the role of a macrophage. Macrophage engulfs a pathogen. Yeah? And then it's going to activate other cells in the immune system. We've already talked about that. And this is how the learned immune system learns to recognize specific types of pathogens. But what we did not discuss, the new stuff, is that the macrophage, in addition to this really wonderful stuff, will then also start to alter gene expression and make proteins, which then go and bind to receptors on other cells to recruit them to fight off infection as well. Okay, so what are these proteins? They are called cytokines. So here's the story. Macrophage, white blood cells, macrophage can make cytokines, which then act as ligands that bind to receptors on other immune cells and then basically coordinate an immune response. And so the cytokine in this case is a ligand, which then binds to other immune cells to fight off infection. Groovy. All right. I'm moving quickly, but you can pause me at any point, go back and finish up the notes off in the margins here. Okay, now we move into specific types of hormones on this slide. Now, hormones, we've discussed generally what are hormones, what are they up to, but on the molecular level, we have very different structural types, categories of hormones. And I'm going to go from basically largest to smallest, sort of. But over here on the left, these are proteins. So their proteins can be, hormones can be proteins. And we call these the peptide hormones because they're loaded with peptide bonds. Those are the bonds that hold together amino acids in a protein. Okay, so peptide hormones such as oxytocin. This is the birth hormone, remember? This increases uterine contraction to push the baby out. All right, oxytocin, peptide hormones. Next, steroid hormones. These are hydrophobic lipids. And here's another review question for you. Get ready to pause me and answer my review question. Steroid hormones, such as estrogen and testosterone, are derived from another familiar steroid, a very important lipid. What is that steroid that is used as a precursor to make estrogen? Pause me, answer that question. All right, the answer to that question was a very important steroid called cholesterol that is then used as a precursor to make estrogen. We learned that back in chapter 2. Cholesterol also obviously in your cell membranes and plays other important roles that I don't have time to go into right now. Okay, so we've got our proteins, peptides. We've got our steroids, lipids. And then we have these guys called amine hormones, and all that amines. That just means that these are they're not full proteins. No, they are simply amino acid. So there's some amino acid that gets modified slightly. So they're amino acid derived. You take an amino acid, you do a little switcheroo, and then you get an amine hormone. One example of that is thyroxine. Remember, thyroxine is our metabolic hormone, helps to regulate body temperature, especially important when you are cold. All right, hormone types. Then we also have neurotransmitter categories, which are very similar. We have our amines, just like before, peptides. Um, so amines are going to be amino acids. Peptides are proteins. I don't know why I wrote amines twice. Whoopsie doopsie. And then we have these sort of fun groups that are very quick and very quick to take on and very quick to go away. So these are gaseous neurotransmitters. And nitrous oxide is our example, also called laughing gas. So laughing gas comes on quickly and then dissipates quickly. So you have a very short-lived sedation for dental work. Nitrous oxide. We know acetylcholine. We're good friends with acetylcholine, and it's sort of in its own category called an ester, and we just think of it as being sort of on the side. We'll come back to why these molecular structures matter in a minute, because it's going to determine how they interact with the cells. So for now, knowing the different categories is good enough. Okay. Last, and I'll make this quick, neurotransmitters have a very localized effect because the neurotransmitter is meant to travel very short distances from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell. That's a few micrometers. Whereas hormones are built to travel very long distances through the bloodstream. So they're going to have very distant effects. So ligands can have localized or distant effects, such as hormones like ADH, antidiuretic hormone that regulates water absorption in the kidney. Remember that? All right, so this smells like a really nice compare and contrast question. What compare and contrast the structure and function of ligands, right? So they both are involved in cell signaling. However, localized cell signaling versus long distance cell signaling. And I think I've hit the end of my length for my video 1. So I'm going to end this video, and then look for part 2 in a separate video. Okay, bye. Now discard. I feel like this is the end of the Zoom call with your parents and they don't know how to hang up.